Good evening, everyone. Everyone knew to get quiet, because as soon as Governor Patrick walked in, the room started getting a little quiet. So hello, I am LaShawn Banks. I am a research fellow at the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise. I am also a professor of practice at Kenan-Flagler Business School right next door. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Dean Speaker Series. The Dean Speaker Series is hosted by the Kenan Institute in partnership with UNC Kenan-Flagler and is made possible through the generous support of Archie K. Davis Endowment. The series brings outstanding scholars and leaders from business, education, government to share thoughts and insights with UNC Kenan-Flagler, the university, and the community at large. Today, we're proud to welcome someone who has distinguished himself in all three areas, former Massachusetts Governor and friend, Deval Patrick, co-director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School. Governor Patrick will discuss resilient leadership in his own leadership journey with UNC Kenan-Flagler Dean Mary Margaret Frank. Here's just a little look at some of that journey. He attended Milton Academy thanks to the organization A Better Chance, and then Harvard College and Harvard Law School. Between college and law school, he lived and worked in East and West Africa. He launched a career in law and business that included time as a staff attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, assistant attorney general for civil rights in the Clinton administration, a partner at 2 Boston law firms, and a senior executive at 2 Fortune 50 companies. He became the first Black governor of Massachusetts after being elected in 2006 and served 2 terms in office. He founded and led an impact investment fund, the first fund in a major financial institution to focus on delivering both superior financial return and significant positive social impact, something that we're about at the Kenan-Flagler Business School. He's the co-director of the Center for Public Leadership and the David R. Gergen Professor of the Practice of Public Leadership at Harvard Kennedy School, where we met. It's an amazing career and touches on so many important issues to discuss today. In addition, Governor Patrick will answer some of the questions in the audience, so please make sure that you hold your questions until the final portion of the program. And so let's not wait another minute to start. This is going to be a great conversation, and I would like to invite Dean Frank to come up and take over.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome. So I appreciate you being here. This is like a kindred spirits. So your path is a really important, I just want to say to me personally, my history has been that I started a group called Trisector Leaders, and you would have been a prime example of that as sort of how do we think about leadership in this uncertain times, sort of how do we bring the understanding of business, government, policy, right, and a variety of things to sort of solve those challenges in a really uncertain environment. And I can't think of anybody who's had, let's think about, so when you were governor, you started 2006?
Yes, 2007. I was elected in 2006.
Okay, so right before...
And then the bottom fell out of the global economy.
Right. That's okay. So you had a financial crisis. Right. You also had a community crisis in the bombing of at the Boston Marathon.
Right.
So you were involved in that as well. And just as the Boston Marathon holds a deep meaning to me. I ran it, and I will tell you, it's one of the most amazing community building experiences I've ever been through. To sort of watch in 2013 sort of the chaos that...
You did not run it that year.
No, right? No. I ran it 20 years before.
Okay.
So, but to watch and to know sort of how that community comes together to celebrate that and then to watch that happen, I can't imagine sort of what you went through as a leader trying to lead through both the financial crisis and through that community crisis. I'm curious, were there commonalities? Were each of those crises different?
Well, they were different in the sense. First of all, thank you very much, Dean Frank, for having me. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. I said on the way in, I understood and understand. You're supposed to be doing exams and stuff. You're supposed to be doing homework. In fact, I'm glad you're all here, and I hope you will join in the conversation. The financial crisis and the global collapse was at the front end.
Right.
Of my 2 terms, and then the Boston Marathon bombing was at the end, so it's sort of bookended. I will say that in both, if there is a commonality or two, I'll illustrate it with a story. I remember we had this group called the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors. You know, the former Fed president and labor economists, business leaders and so on, and they convened right after the recession was formally declared, and they said, Governor, we think you should know that Massachusetts historically goes into recession deeper and stays in longer than the rest of the country during most recessions. And I said, uh-huh. And they said, well, I just thought you should know. And I said, well, that's not enough. You know, we've got to, why wait for circumstances to improve? We got to have a strategy and build our way out of it. And so we developed a strategy where the emphasis was on education, innovation, and infrastructure. And I'm very proud of the fact that when we left, we came from the bottom to a 25-year employment high. We were first in the nation in student achievement, in healthcare coverage. 98% of our residents have healthcare, have health insurance. First in the nation in innovation, entrepreneurship. So we were purposeful. And I think there was something about finding our way to the other side of that crisis at the Boston Marathon, and this is part of it, right?
Right.
Imagining the day after and what you want that to be, and then driving toward that. Now, having said that, Dean Frank, I have to tell you, I was governor at the time, but it was a team, and I think my job was understanding, asking lots and lots of questions of folks about what they needed to do their best and bring their best, including the cover they needed politically to try new things and to innovate around solutions. And that is what I have found gets the best out of the team, and we got the best out of the team.
Yeah, you had said to me earlier, you asked actually me the question, sort of, what's your vision, what drives you, what's your purpose? So when you're sitting there dealing with the crisis of the Boston Marathon, what was your vision, your purpose in getting through that?
Well, I didn't want us to devolve into, chaos and fear more than what was, direct and natural from the attack. I mean, it's interesting. I was asked this question earlier with a group of students, and I made the point then that I reflect on a lot now, which is that today we think of that terrible tragedy as pretty cut and dry. 2 guys, 2 bombs, 2 terrorist needles in a haystack found in about 100 hours. We didn't know that. We didn't know that the first day. We didn't know it was just 2 guys until after the second one, about 2 weeks after the second one was apprehended. The public didn't know that, but the investigation continued. And I think, with all of that swirl happening, we knew we were going to need everybody, not just the officials. And this is the point. We needed the best of law enforcement. We needed the best of the medical and related recovery services. But we needed the best of citizens, too. And we have, I love the way you talk about the Boston Marathon. Someone described it as the sort of region-wide block party. We don't have a reputation in Massachusetts for being all that warm. I'm not just talking about the temperature.
Yeah.
But it's an unusual global gathering. Mm-hmm. And it had implications for other civic gatherings that are important to us, like on the Esplanade at the 4th of July. Where big crowds of people come come together. And we needed to come out of that not being afraid of each other and civic or community gatherings. And so we needed to be thinking about that through all of these different decisions that had to be made on the law enforcement or recovery or, what have you side.
Well, that also seems to translate if we think about returning from COVID, right? And sort of what I just heard you say is we shouldn't be afraid of each other. And I think about as we came back from COVID, how do we, if you were to take that lesson and think about what we should have done as we returned from COVID, because a lot of people were scared of each other to come back and convene. Is there anything from that you would have advised people to do?
Well, I will say this. And I'm going to take a chance because it'll sound a little partisan.
Okay.
And just to be clear, I'm a Democrat. I'm not the sort of Democrat who thinks you have to hate Republicans to be a good Democrat. But I think had President Trump managed COVID more responsibly, he'd be president today. And I think there was just, I couldn't have imagined a public health emergency being turned into a partisan thing before that. And yet it was. And we got we got inconsistent information, let me put it that way.
Okay.
I was co-chair of something called I think it was the COVID Response Task Force. And it was voluntary. I had a Republican former governor as the co-chair, and we had all kinds of public health experts and medical folks and researchers and business folks, education experts in this, trying to come up with consensus approaches that we could then put out about, for example, testing early on. I didn't appreciate this, but as one person put it, if you knew that everybody in the restaurant had tested negative, and you tested negative, you'd go to that restaurant. So had testing been available widely and cheap or free, there's a lot about our managing through that experience that might have been different.
Well, you brought up this notion of consistency in communication. And communication seems to be such an important part of managing through any crisis. Is there any other aspect of communication or elaborating on this notion of consistency in communication that you would advise?
Whenever I think of the term communication in a crisis context or any other, I think about the importance of listening. And asking, particularly for the leader to ask lots of questions. Did you follow, are we recorded? Is this all in the room? Okay, yeah, I'm not buying it. Anyway, one governor up in our neighborhood during COVID was communicating a lot, talking a lot. And there were ways in which it was really nice at the beginning, but it became about him talking a lot and not about us, trying to figure a way forward together. And that is a real risk in leadership, that you make it about you and not about us. And so I think that one of the ways I try to avoid that, I don't always get that right, but one of the ways I've tried to avoid that is by listening hard and asking the folks who actually have to do the work, who actually have to make the decisions, as I said earlier, what they need from me to enable them to bring their best. And sometimes what they need is cover, believe it or not, right? You got to be the one to give them publicly the praise when it goes well, and then shoulder the blame if it doesn't, if it goes sideways.
So what I hear you saying is consistency, but consistency in the we, not the me.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. So, and one of the things I think is interesting is to think, is there differences? So let's take that as a given, right? Are there also differences in how you might think about the way you communicate when you're a politician versus or a leader in the political realm? I think that's probably a better way to say that. versus a leader in a public company, versus a leader in a private company, versus a leader in a large company versus a small company? Are there any, because you've had a lot of different experiences, were there any differences in the way you might communicate?
Well, I hope not. I hope mostly, I mean, I'd like to, I think it's sound bites. I'd like to be shorter and more succinct. I try to use plain words. I try to think about all of the people who are listening, not just the ones who are you think you're speaking to. I mean, there's a funny thing about leadership, right? You're leading when you don't think you are, right? I have a way. My kids have pointed this out. When I listen, I scowl, and my kids used to say to their friends, "He's not mad. He's just listening." And have you noticed how some people in public life, they always seem to be grinning? They always seem they speak to you through a grin. Oh, I'm so sorry about your mother's death. You know, it's completely inappropriate. And I began to realize when one particularly unfriendly newspaper would, there'd be some really happy news I'd announce when I was in office, and they'd have a picture of me scowling on the front. That you're always, whatever you do is interpreted by people. And you know what? I will say that is not just true of leaders. If you're, I grew up in Chicago on the South Side. In the South Side in those days, everybody was from the South. My family, my people were all from Kentucky and Virginia and Arkansas, and so we had sort of Southern ways, right? We said hello. We stood when an elder came and you listened to elders. You never spoke over them, even when they were lying. You didn't speak over them. Yeah. Have you noticed when you're in a hurry and you're rushing through some door, if the person in front of you is in a hurry and rushes through the door without holding it for you, it can affect your whole day. When they do, it can also affect your whole day. And so just being mindful of those small acts of grace, I think I would like to be that kind of man. I'm still trying to be that kind of man, but I think as a leader, you really have to be mindful that everything you do, the expressions, everything is subject to interpretation, and rather than be all wound up and self-conscious in the sense of not being your whole self, right. Just be your whole self and explain yourself as you do, and I think that helps.
So do you mind, you said, if I go back, you said my people, but in South Side Chicago, were from Kentucky. So is that in reference, may I ask, is that in reference, if we think about the migration from the South to the North?
Sure.
Okay, sure. For clarification, the reason I asked that is one of the best books I ever read was The Warmth of Other Suns.
Amazing.
Yeah. So in case you all don't know, The Warmth of Other Suns is a fantastic book by Isabel Wilkerson about the Great Migration from the South to the North. And
in the 20s and 30s, and beautifully and brilliantly researched. It's
brilliantly researched.
Specific.
Yeah. It was, I always say that was one of the more transformative, having been from the South, and other than going to work in Southside Chicago, it's my only venture outside of the South. It was a transformative read because it was so well researched, and it was really grounded. It was this beautiful narrative of research and stories. So
you were on the South Side.
I was. I taught at the University of Chicago, which I consider that's
Hyde
Park.
Yeah,
we're good.
So my neighborhood was on the other side of Washington Park.
Yeah,
so the neighborhood that they tell the students not to cross into.
Yeah, that's where I used to have to park.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. And you remember when I would have been in the 50s and early 60s that the Robert Taylor homes went up all the way down State Street. So we were one block in on Wabash.
Yeah.
And the schools, the elementary schools were built as a part of the Robert Taylor Homes project because there were so many families.
Right.
So I went to school in the Robert Taylor Homes a block away, and it was wild.
Yeah. It was it was a transformative experience for me moving from the South up there and engaging, because in Southside Hyde Park, you walked to parking that was not necessarily at the University of Chicago.
Right.
And so experienced that world.
Yep.
So, it's interesting when you think about, we've talked a lot about leadership and being resilient in leadership, and as the world continues, it just feels like something's around the corner all the time. How do you, it would be great if we had perfect foresight. We'd be amazing leaders if we had perfect foresight. But, in your experience, how do you get better at anticipating what a crisis might be? That to me, as a leader, it's good to be nimble and have that sort of more foresight than others, and being able to get prepared and prepare your team for what you think might be coming. Do you have any advice?
Well,
for
I
those
think
of us?
there's some very practical things, and I teach some of this, tabletop exercises and that sort of thing. Getting to know who leads the various agencies and other the business leaders and so forth, whom you will need in a crisis response, the medical leaders and so forth, and having plans and so forth. In the Marathon bombing, for example, we had some good fortune. It's a weird way to describe,
Right.
but we had lots of injuries that would otherwise have been fatal, but for the fact that we had all of these ambulances in the medical tent or by the medical tent at the finish line, which we always do. And the first surgery, I think, was like 5 or 6 minutes after the first bomb went off. The only people who lost their lives were the ones who were killed instantly at the finish line, 3 people, which is extraordinary. And I didn't appreciate until I visited the hospitals that it was our plan, our emergency mass casualty plan, that the hospitals had practiced. So everybody went to the hospital for the acuity appropriate for the hospital that was appropriate for the acuity of their industry, and it was magic. And then, of course, those heroic stories like the doctor who was running and finished the race and kept running to Mass General Hospital and got into his scrubs and started doing surgery. There were stories like that over and over again, and telling those stories publicly, telling about the acts of grace that individuals were showing, whether they had a direct role or just folks on the route who got runners and brought them into their homes and gave them water and warmed them up and explained what was happening, helped them connect with their family and friends and belongings back in the city, was a part of it. So practice, getting to know the folks you will have to lean on, in and out of government, and I actually think this is true in business, in and out of your business. Whatever the kind of emergency, but again, this idea of being able to imagine what you want the day after to be, and driving toward that. It's a subtle thing, but if you're clear about your why, then it should influence the choices you make, and there are lots and lots of choices, whether it's a crisis or not. I will say one more thing, in government anyway, and maybe it's true in certain businesses now, it's hard to distinguish between crisis and routine. I'll bet you have days that feel that way.
Did you check my calendar?
You gotta go, right?
Well, it's interesting because I think sometimes for some people, network is like, I know for me as an introvert, network's like a bad word almost, because it's like, oh, that's exhausting. It feels fake to some degree, right? But what you've just sort of illustrated is actually network is, if you're thinking about it that way, network is about preparing for the crisis in the future. It's actually got really positive outcomes. sometimes I think we think about networking as being all about us and getting us where we need to go.
Right.
But you've just set a vision, networking is about being prepared for and having.
Very much.
Right.
Very much. And again, on the list of things that were blessings for us in the midst of that tragedy, that same team, the head of Massachusetts Emergency Management, the head of the state police, the head of the Boston police, the medical folks, we had worked through a bunch of crises before, from a water main break that threatened the drinking water for, I think, 60 days of the eastern half of the state, and that they repaired in 3 days, I will say. Tornadoes, snowstorms, we'd been through this before. We knew each other.
Do you have an example of where your business network, so as governor, where your network working like with business leaders helped in a situation?
Yeah, I think in every one of those,
Okay.
first of all, because you have to be mindful, right, we're talking about, we're not talking about voters, we're talking about citizens who live their lives. They have to get to and from work. They have to know that's safe. They have to know, in the case of if we have really good data about storms, that it's time to shut down. You can't just talk to the citizens about that. You have to talk to the bosses too, so they can make plans and think in advance about how to manage that. And certainly, the financial crisis and the recession, that growth strategy wasn't about government. It was it's not even mainly about government. It was, where were the sweet spots where we could collaborate, and we got a lot of strengths, a lot of inherent strengths in Massachusetts, but the collaborative gene need a little encouragement. So, I mean, the Life Sciences Initiative, for example, which is one of the ways we climbed out of recession, it was $1 billion state commitment over 10 years. That's a lot of money to me. It's actually not a lot of money in over 10 years in our budget, but it was mostly not government money. It was the 300 colleges, universities, research institutions, teaching hospitals within 45 minutes of downtown Boston being a part of that. It was the venture capital community being a part of that. It was the extant biotech companies seeing the opportunity to do cluster growth. We had to think about transportation. We had to think about direct flights to innovation centers overseas, and so I didn't know all this at the beginning,
right?
But I knew it was not just going to be government, and that we were going to have multi-sector collaboration to make it work, and that what I could bring was to the so-called bully pulpit. I could keep selling that message both at home and overseas, and that was about a network too.
So you and I both have done a lot of work with cross-sector public-private partnerships, and what would you say is the biggest challenge in engaging a cross-sector?
Well, I think it's probably like a lot of challenges that boil down to human nature and bad habits. You can't make policy, you can't make a deal unless you make friends first. And you just, we're so afraid of each other. It's really interesting. I've done business and helped solve problems all over the world, and the line between the private and the public sector is a lot brighter in this country, you know what I'm talking about, than it is in a lot of other places. The collaboration is a lot more fluid. It's not always above board, but it's a lot less foreboding.
Mm-hmm.
The business folks I know often think they know everything about government, how sloppy and wasteful and what have you it is, and some of my colleagues in government have no idea about the amount of money wasted in private industry on a day-to-day basis, but we have these sort of set views of each other, just like folks do of the next neighborhood over there,
Right.
and the people who live in it. And until you pierce those suppositions, until you take a beat and just wait and listen, and let people reveal what they know and don't know, and let you reveal what you know and don't know, it's really hard to make friends. It's really hard to get stuff done. So frankly, I celebrate, more than celebrate, I think there is an urgency to cross-sector collaborative learning and leadership, because most of the big challenges that face humankind are not going to be solved by one sector all on its own. It's going to take all the sectors kind of leaning in and learning from and supporting each other in what each sector can contribute to the whole solution.
You know, it's interesting when you say ask questions. I would say we have to have a curiosity about the other sector.
Right.
Right? To your point, sort of walking in thinking you know, I think that was one of the sort of one of the greatest ahas, is to bring the students in and have them engage and realize, wow, taking business students in to meet with government officials, and the magnitude of the problem that the government officials are dealing with, and being able to hear that and be like, oh, wow, okay, it's humbling, right?
We are so influenced by the narratives, the prevailing narratives. We know what we think we know. You know, we are in government and in the private sector. What I've found is you can issue edicts all day long from the C-suite, but unless you go and persuade middle management, it's not going to happen, because they're busy. They have stuff to do that relates to the other edicts issued by you or others from the C-suite, and they can help you figure out how to get done better what you want to get done. There's a humility, I think, that is essential to effective leadership, and that kind of approach, I think, is for me similar, whether it's the private sector or the public sector. I think on this point of narratives that stick, that business is always efficient and government is always not. I remember we had, you remember the Central Artery, I-93? That's the main highway that runs through downtown Boston. It's jammed all the time. It is an absolutely indispensable way to get in and out of the central business district. There were 14 bridges on the Central Artery from the northern edge of Boston up, almost to New Hampshire, that were failing and that had to be replaced. 14 bridges. Now, I don't know about y'all, but bridges take a long time in Massachusetts. We replaced 14 bridges in 14 weekends in one summer. And it was brilliant. I mean, I'm a frustrated architect. I was so fascinated by they did this incredible plan with a lot of consultation with the businesses and residents who would be affected off of the exits. And they built the new bridge alongside the old bridge. They demolished the old bridge 1 weekend at a time, lots of notice, at 8 p.m., I think it was, on a Friday, rolled the new bridge in place, connected it, and it was ready to go at 5 a.m. on Monday morning. 14 times over the weekend.
They might need to go to Baltimore now.
But they planned for a long time.
Wow.
And they talked to a lot of people. And I was over the moon excited and having encouraged them, because if it had gone wrong, it was going to be on me. And they needed to know this was the kind of innovation, because it was so thoughtful, the kind of innovation I wanted to see. And it went right, zero news. Zero news. Now, healthcare reform, Governor Romney signs. It took effect the day I was sworn in, so we had to implement it. We got to 98% insured before there was such a thing called Obamacare. And then Obamacare came in, had a lot of stuff we wanted, a lot of features that were not in ours, but it was modeled on ours more or less. They had a website, we had to integrate with our website, and when we did, our website failed. That got news, right? That was news.
Right.
We went from 98% to 98.5% insured while the website was down. Why? Because the point wasn't the website. Healthcare reform was not about the website. It was about getting people insured. And so what happened? Folks took clipboards and went to the places where the uninsured were and got them signed up. No news. The news was the website failure. My point is that, and when we had things go sideways at my companies, no news. It's not what you expect. What you expect is efficiency and so forth, and you don't expect innovation and creativity in government. And so I feel like you got to get closer to it and see the extraordinary things that people do, the creativity they show in government, in the private sector, and the way problems get solved to kind of push through the prevailing narrative at any given time.
Picking up on that narrative notion, you and I were talking about it, sort of what was how do we change the narrative? So there's the narrative about government. How do we change the narrative about business? And that business is billions, it's succession, the TV shows that are out there. I struggle.
It
right?
was good though.
It was. I got it. There's good TV.
I've never seen houses like that. Oh my God.
It's good TV, but it paints to your point, it paints a narrative about what the world thinks about what business can do, yet business is actually one of the greatest engines for change that our world has ever known.
Look,
so how do we fix that?
I'm a capitalist, but I am not a market fundamentalist. I don't believe that markets solve every problem in everybody's life right on time. But I like what expanding markets can do and the opportunity they can create. And I think we have had for some time now, and I would say a bastardization of Milton Friedman, but I'm not a scholar of Milton Friedman. But we've had a view that an economy that grew up was okay, so that I'm going to paint with a very broad brush now, but the investor class was winning, and it would all trickle down rather than growing out to the middle and to the marginalized. And I credit President Biden for thinking about it that way. And industrial policy is not a bad thing. It's you can't go too far, right? But it's not crazy to say we're going to play to our strengths. It's more than not crazy. I think, frankly, when I hear, and I do on our campus from time to time, young people, rail about the private sector and the evils of it and so on. And I get it, but I then ask them, to whom do you pay your rent? Where do you work? Who feeds you? I mean, most of us play and entertain ourselves, and all of that in the private sector. So we got to make it work. My understanding, I'm taking a risk saying this to a scholar, but my understanding is that at the beginning of the concept of corporation, it was a public good. That's why you got a license. And you had at least unstated expectations, but understood expectations that that's what we now call stakeholder capitalism, right? That you're supposed to pay attention to all of the interests, not just the owners, but the workers, the neighborhood. That was what was expected of a company, and frankly, how you built long-term value. Short-termism is one of the things I think has been hurting us in capitalism and in business. I think it's been hurting us in government too, by the way. It's not quarter to quarter, but it's election cycle to election cycle or news cycle to news cycle. And I think that's a problem. But I think you think of storied brands, companies that have contributed so much to so many for so long. They were founded and maintained a culture for a long time about long-term value and growth in that sense. I think that's what impact investing is about, which is what we were talking about.
Yeah. So, you mentioned having clear vision was important to you. You've articulated, you have a way of thinking about leadership. If I could take you back just a little bit, okay? Because we're all influenced by different events and people in our lives. Mm-hmm. Is there a person or event that sort of sharpened your focus on the kind of leader you wanted to be, or got you thinking about this sort of, it's important to have a vision, it's important to ask questions?
You said you're going to take me back a little bit. You're going to
take me back a long way, yes. As far back as you want to go.
Well, so there may be two examples of people or groups of people. One, I mentioned I grew up on the South Side, I was on welfare our family was on welfare for some while until my mother got a GED and got a job at the post office. And we started to see a way forward. She started to see a way forward. But I lived with my grandparents, my sister, and my mother, and all sorts of other relatives who came and went in my grandparents' 2-bedroom tenement. And those big and broken and under-resourced and sometimes violent schools had well-prepared teachers. Mm-hmm. And they paid attention to me. In some ways, I got attention from my teachers I couldn't get at home, positive attention, that is, that I couldn't get at home. I was telling a story about earlier about a 6th grade teacher of mine who taught us to count and say the greetings in German, and took us to the first opera we'd ever seen, and took us to a new movie out at the time called The Sound of Music, and used it to introduce us to modern European history and the rise of the Nazis. And 35 kids just as broken and as I was, but a teacher who made us imagine what it might be like to be a citizen of the world, that this was ours too. All of it was ours. And she stayed in my life, and I in hers. She was present when I graduated from Milton Academy and from Harvard College and Harvard Law School, when I was married, when I was sworn in at the Justice Department. She passed away before my inauguration, but my 3rd grade teacher was at my inauguration. Okay. And there were teachers and other adults in that neighborhood at a time, when you were under the jurisdiction of every adult on the block, mm-hmm. who helped you understand you belong to each other. You have a stake in each other's dreams and struggles, that there is value in a sense of community, whether that's a neighborhood or, as I've come to think about it, a state or a nation, for that matter, that we need to see and hear each other, and we are invested in some level in each other's dreams and struggles. And then there's one other, and I wouldn't say I got that when I was 14, right. But I've reflected on that over the years, and it lasts. When I was 15, I was home for a school vacation, and I was late to meet someone, and I went to get a bus up on Garfield Boulevard. So you know what I'm talking about, right? Going east. Mm-hmm. And I was going to meet them over at the Museum of Science and Industry. This is neighborhood talk right now. And I went running up to the bus stop, and this old Chicago Transit Authority bus comes wheezing up just as I get there. I jump on the bus, and I reach into my pocket, and they still had coin boxes. This is how, most of y'all don't know what I'm talking about, but you had actually paid the money on the bus. And I realized I didn't have enough money for the fare. And I have described this man, I don't know his name, as this old black driver. He was probably younger than I am now, but I thought he was this grizzly black and white, salt and pepper beard. Yeah. And he looked at me, and the bus is moving now. And I think, okay, he's going to let me have it. And he pointed to the chair closest to the door, and he says, "Sit down, son." And I sat down, and I'm blubbering and apologizing, and I said maybe the fare changed, I was in a hurry. And he turned to me, and he looked me up and down, and he, the way people who serve the public can size you up like that. And he turned back to the road, and his expression softened, and he said, just pass it on, son. Just pass it on. And it just struck me as such an incredibly simple act of grace. And it had a huge impact on me, and it still does. And so when I think about this or that assignment, this or that opportunity, I'm thinking about those lessons of what it is we are supposed to do in our time to leave things better for those who come behind. You may not be able to solve it forever or get us all to the promised land, but you have to do what you can do in our time. And I feel like that's a charge I got from those teachers and from the old ladies in hats in church and from that bus driver.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to mention something real quick. So just in the common, sort of, you never know what you have in common. My grandfather was a postman.
Is that right?
Yeah.
All right. I thought you were going to tell me he was a bus driver.
No, he's a postman.
I just called him old there.
He was a postman in the South, but he was a postman, right? You just, there are commonalities, amongst all people.
That's right.
Right.
That's
so, it's, how do you think? Because it really resonates with me. I think partly because I have kids who are of the phone generation, right? Let's call it a smartphone generation, and how we feel connected, but yet we're so isolated.
Yeah.
Right? And how can both the public sector and the private sector work together? Because what I hear you saying is there is such a need for community, right? I heard you say, do we know the people that live next door anymore, right? I actually feel like a lot of times we don't, right? Because we're so busy going in and out, right, and moving around and getting to our next place that, and I'll put myself on the thing. I spent 20 years living in a house, and I don't know if I knew my neighbors, I'm not even sure I knew my neighbor's first name. Right? And I didn't really need to because I had all this sort of connectivity through my phone.
Yep.
And so how is it that as a public sector leader, private sector leader, we can work together to create that community to some degree that we've somewhat lost?
Well, I think one thing
Or I'll posit that we've potentially lost.
I don't think we've lost the appetite for it.
Okay.
But I think we have to think about it in ways that are not nostalgic. In other words, I'm not trying to go back to the 50s and 60s.
That's a great point.
But I think what's fascinating to me when I remember I got the first briefing. I still had my security. I was out of office, but I still had my security clearance. I got my first briefing about the extent of foreign interference in the 2016 presidential election, and it was deep. We know a lot of it now. It's public now, but it was shocking to me. But I thought about it at the time, and I thought more than the fact that we have become divided is that it's so easy to divide us. And it's easy to divide us because we don't know each other. And we don't really have mechanisms to know each other. Universities used to be one, but that's harder to do. It's not for everybody. And it's one of the reasons why I believe so strongly in national service. We've got all these unmet needs. I would love it. I wish it were mandatory, frankly, like Israel, but that's not going to happen here, I don't think. But I don't think it has to be military. We have civilian needs. There are lots of ways where people, and we've done some of this in Massachusetts with 8th graders, where people can come together and do come together with folks who are different than they. And they're not there just to stare at each other in a circle and say, I'm different, how are you different? But actually to work alongside each other, doing meaningful stuff, getting tired and dirty together, making jokes together, sharing their lunches and so forth. And you start to understand that the person you thought you knew from the caricature that is portrayed in, the media, social or otherwise, or movies and what have you, is actually a multi-dimension, really complex person, just like you, right? Because none of us fit in the box. None of us do. But we still are encouraged to squeeze other people into a box. And I do think, to your first point about what social media has done, we are connected but lonely. And it's like I gave a commencement speech once about this very thing. You can break up by text, but you can't fall in love. You can't. I mean, you need some connection. So to the question about what public leaders can do, there are programs, but they're convenings. There are ways you show up in neighborhood. It's trying to make sure that what happened at the Boston Marathon didn't mean we didn't have the July 4th, thousands of people on the Esplanade. We were very, very intentional about and conspicuous about the security around that, about the intention of having it. I showed up myself, and that we're going to try it with some more restrictions, but we're going to try it, and we did, and it lives on. So I think they're maybe gestures. I don't know if they're programs, with the exception of the service idea, which I hope will take hold one day.
Well, what I hear you say is lead by example. Show up. I mean, we don't always have leaders who show up, right?
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. I mean, you can't be everywhere. We don't have term limits in Massachusetts. I have a term limit named Diane. And she said, 2 terms and that is it, and you better show up at home.
Well, I think empowering people, right, encouraging people to show up when you can't, right?
Right.
Sort of picking a group or picking your team that sort of has the same values.
Or those small things. I didn't realize that it was as important when we were saying before a blizzard, this is what we expect. Please stay home and off the road so we can clear them for you. Get the supplies you need, batteries and so forth. Everybody goes to get bread. They eat more bread what is that? During a
comfort
blizzard.
food.
But anyway. And then just to say, go check on your neighbor. Yeah. Just check. See if they have what they need. And, people would do it. And it's a start.
Well, so I want to pivot just a little bit. You've been working, the other thing we have in common is I taught impact investing, you lived it. And so I'm really curious selfishly to get your perspective on sort of, because you were there at the beginning, right? And you've watched impact investing grow and evolve. And so my first question for you is how would you, because we talked, how would you, because people come to, you say the word impact investing and everybody has a definition.
Yeah.
So my first
question. And they often conflate ESG,
right,
which is not the same thing.
And so I'm curious, sort of, what would you define as impact investing, and what got you interested in it, and what's kept you in it as it's evolved?
So one friendly amendment to the question. I wasn't there at the beginning. I was there when it went mainstream.
Fair point. Okay. Yes, agreed.
Because it had been happening, especially with startups.
Agreed.
For a long time, and actually quite mature in Europe as opposed to here, as you know. I got interested in impact investing actually through social impact bonds. We didn't talk about this. When I was in office, I met Ronald Cohen, and I loved this concept. He came to pitch the concept with Tracy Palanchen. You know Tracy?
Yeah, I've read 3 cases on social impact bonds. I'm with you.
Yeah, they came to pitch the concept when I was in office. You all know what I'm talking about? Social impact bonds? The concept generally, you'll correct me.
You go ahead. No, I won't.
Is that you bring private capital inside a law government to try an alternative solution. And the way I think about it is you get proof points from that you then can take to the legislature to make the case for doing something different. And that it's matured because now the emphasis, and it always ought to have been on outcomes and not just outputs. And
the other thing, just for the investor gets their return based on the outcome or output. So it's a variable return.
Exactly.
Your incentives are aligned in the sense that if I'm giving you money to do it, I get a better return the better the social impact is. I want you to, like, our incentives are now aligned.
Right.
That makes sense. So
that's a critical part I left out.
That's okay.
And the measurement of what is success has been a learning too. We did, I think, 2 or 3 of the first ones in the country, and I'd say 2 of the 3 or 1 of the 2 was good, and we learned a ton. But Ronnie had his own impact fund, and we stayed in touch. And as I was leaving, he was telling me about it, and I said, "What kind of returns are you getting?" He said, "Well, as good or better than my regular way private equity fund." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Well, that's kind of the point." He said, "I'm trying to show that you don't have to trade return for impact." Now, I think that's a pretty powerful idea because the business sector is so big, it is so impactful already, and if it can be intentional about positive impact, and that's the difference, right? That not just do no harm, but actually intentional about positive, measurable social or environmental impact, all to the good. Why not invest in that? And frankly, I think there are secular trends pushing in this direction too. Right? We're all driving things differently and eating differently and choosing our clothes and all that. There's an awareness now about that is much more widespread about the impact of our own choices, driven largely by a younger generation and a few of us who wish we were. And I think that's a really good thing. So why not invest behind it? Many in the field, I mean, we chose a superior market rate of return, financial return, alongside measurable impact, meaning this is the kind of company, this is the benchmark, this is what we're trying to get to in financial and a specific social or environmental outcome at the other end. And we picked 3 verticals that were by their nature impactful: healthcare and education, and one we called sustainability that we didn't do very well. But the other 2 we did crazy well. And we talked about this earlier. I think there's a great deal of debate about what is real impact, and are you measuring, second and third order impact, or is it direct? Should there be one measure of impact, which I think is impossible, but that has been a debate in the field, as you know. But I think the trend is important and worth it, and it's a great way to do well and do good.
What's interesting is I think one of the things of having people really think about impact, what I found is that it opened, if you think about when you're funding, right, people looked at, we can fund this, and this was the circle we funded.
Yep.
But as impact investing became a thing, you started looking outside of the Silicon Valley circle, right? You started looking at other places to fund, right? In small towns, we're getting funding. Right, you talked about sort of the one where the dentist,
yeah,
right? So great idea, but it's not capturing the attention because it's not tech oriented, right? So this having people look at a broader lens of who should get funding and for what ideas. I think impact investing really brought an awareness as to all the great things that could be funded, not just tech funding.
Not just tech, and not just startups. No. And that's a really, I feel it was an important choice we made, because there were a lot of impact. This is why I said we weren't first in the field. There are a lot of impact investors who were investing in great ideas, companies that were getting off the ground, incredibly important. But they come to a point, a successful company does, when they need the next capital partner. And because a growing company can attract, I mean, in a normal market, can attract that growth capital for their next stage, getting the capital wasn't, in most cases, the hard part. It was getting a capital partner who was interested in the whole of what that mission founder was trying to do. So not just the financial part of it, but the social or environmental impact of it. And that's where we saw an opening, and we just drove right into it.
It's interesting. So you talked about the beginning, right? And so when we started teaching it, it was all about what we call venture capital.
Right.
It was all about starting new companies. The issue is in any venture capital, there has to be some place for it to go. It doesn't typically IPO. Somebody acquires it and then takes it growth. Right. And when we started in this space before it sort of became mainstream, the question was always, so who's going to buy them?
Right.
Because the next stage outside of impact in any investment is you go from venture capital to the next growth stage, and who was going to be the next
right.
place for that, and you all became that place.
That's right.
Right.
That's
okay.
Right.
So now you're still doing it.
I am.
What keeps you in it?
I love it. I mean, I think you meet incredible people, and the stage of the companies is such that often the founders are still involved. Actually, that's one of the hardest parts, because sometimes the companies outgrow the founders' capabilities, or it's a family, and they want to harvest some of what they've built, what have you, and they're trying to assure that what they birthed grows up to be what they intended to be, and I think being in that space is fantastic. In the firm I am with now, the Vistria Group out of Chicago, they started around the time we did. Mm-hmm. They grew much faster. They made different choices, but the sectors were similar, and they've added a credit fund now and a real estate fund. And the real estate fund is doing affordable housing and workforce housing, which is a huge unmet need, and very intentional about bringing in the folks to restore that stock that are themselves burgeoning, often black or brown owned or women owned businesses, so they get a chance too. It's fun. Yeah. And we're going to start experimenting soon with employee ownership, which is a thing I've been really interested in, and trying to figure out how to share the equity differently and meaningfully. It's not easy. You probably looked at some of those models.
I was going to say ESOPs.
Yeah, yeah. Ownership Works is a great. Have you been following them? Actually, we should probably bring others into this conversation. Talking about.
Well, it's been really wonderful to engage with you. I mean, as I said at the beginning, I feel like we're kindred spirits between the Chicago and the impact investing and the cross sector.
And the post office.
And the post office. I can't forget the post office. I'd be curious if you had, if you're thinking about sort of a parting wisdom that, given your experiences and where we need to go as a country, what would you challenge us to do?
As a country, first of all, I think we are forgetting that thinking big is a part of who we are. Imagining our ambitions and then working for them. And I would like to see us take those kinds of chances again. We can, I believe, eliminate poverty. I don't think it's inevitable. I think we've just gotten, so we accept it. I think we can think in fresh ways about what it means to be educated. And I think that's beginning to happen, and being a lifelong learner and how important that is, and seeing yourself as a citizen of the world and a member of community, incredibly important. I just hope that we aren't consumed by our prevailing cynicism, because I think a lot of people confuse cynicism for sophistication. It's not. Cynicism never made a meaningful and lasting change in the history of time. But aspiration with a hard-headedness can do it, and I think in some ways it's been indicative of the best of who we are in this country, and I'm hoping I'm hoping for that.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing your dream with us and your dreams. So thank you for being here.
Good to be with you. Yeah.
Oh, I guess we can.
Fine with me.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
We'll take just a couple.
You gotta
of
go though.
questions.
No, I'm good.
Okay.
We'll take just a couple of questions because we do want to get to the reception, which is in the lounge next door, so you all can meet and do this networking that we talk so much about. So do we have any pressing or burning questions?
This one right here.
Or advice.
Yeah.
Just one.
Right here, and then we have a young lady right up here. Raise your hand high for me in the black shirt. Thank you. So we'll start with you with the microphone.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. I have two questions. One is about being a transformational leader. So here at UNC and in the top business school, we have been thought about being innovative, being transformational, bringing change to the organization you're joining. What about when you find yourself in an environment that is only willing to take baby steps? So what do you do at that point in time? How will you still go about engaging your vision? Second question is about managing communication with the public as a leader. So you alluded to the point about having your good intentions misinterpreted. Like once people have a way of interpreting things depending on how they conceive it. So how do you manage that to make sure that as a leader, you're getting the right communication to the public and your good intentions are not being misinterpreted?
Wow.
Thank you.
Okay. One question per customer. Tell me your name. Blessing? Beautiful name. So transformational leadership. I think, when you talk, Blessing, about the baby steps, I think it's almost always baby steps until it's not. In other words, there's preparation for the transformation, and I'm an impatient leader. I would say that is one of my faults of a long list, but I understand the arc of time. And I understand sometimes you set the stage and then the transformation comes. You may not be there, but it's still important. I garden and I keep bees, and the reasons I like those things is because they make me slow down and appreciate that I am not in control of time, that some things have their own season. And so I think that if you are not just emphatic, but sincere and persuasive about the destination, then it's a little like a relay race, right? You run as hard and as fast as you can, you hand it off to somebody else, and they may get the laurel, but you contributed to it. I think that's, frankly, maybe that's just a way of rationalizing or comforting yourself that you don't get 100% of your agenda done. On the question of communication, please, we did not always get it right. I mean, I won office I'd never run for anything before I ran for governor. And I won the nomination against a well-respected, very well-known presumptive nominee. And then I won the general by a big, big margin. And again, running at the grassroots and inviting people, really, not to make this not my campaign, but theirs. I have an old friend I went to see right after he'd won a U.S. Senate seat to tell him, after helping him with his campaign, that I was going to run for governor. And he was unpacking his boxes in the basement of the Senate office building. I said, Barack, I'm going to run for governor. And he said, huh. He said, you got any money? I said, nope. He said, you got any people? I said, nope. He said, what's your name recognition? I said, 2% on the days we're bragging? I said, probably is 1%. And he said, I'm in. I think we shared a view that in a democracy, you get the government you deserve. And if you want better government, if you want better leadership, you have to invite people to take that into their own hands. and not be the hero leader. And so I came in with this great big margin, and we had to have the inauguration outside in January. This is a big deal in Boston, by the way, big risk, because we couldn't fit them all inside, and I thought I was all that. And I remember the state police said, "You got to get a new car." I said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, Governor Romney's car is dying or dead. You got to get a new one." And I said, "Well, just get the one he had." And they said, "They don't make it anymore." And I said, "Well, go get the one that the other governors drive." I'm trying to put a cabinet together and all that sort of thing. Well, it turns out most other governors, at least then, drove a Cadillac sedan. And I remember one of my, to the point that you are communicating even when you don't think you are, one of my young staff people said, "Governor, I understand. You want to be just like every other governor." He said, "But don't be a black man with a Cadillac. Don't do it. It will communicate something you don't intend." And I said, "I don't have time for that. Just get the car. I don't want to think about this anymore." And they got the car and they fitted it out with, the siren and the lights and all that sort of thing. And it was reported on in the headline of that unfriendly paper as Patrick's tricked out ride. Now, I knew what was in there, right? And it didn't do to say, cut it out, I know what you're saying, that, I get to be like every other governor. It wasn't the point. It was, I had to be self-aware. I had to own being the first. As a friend of mine whose dad is a preacher, he said, the congregation has to learn the preacher's voice. And I didn't want the preacher's voice to be about a Cadillac. I wanted it to be about the agenda and the civic engagement. So we didn't always get it right. I had to learn that. But I had also to teach my team not to be constrained by being misunderstood, because it's impossible. It's somebody's going to get it wrong or impute, ill intent. So it's not a very good answer, but that's all I got.
One more.
Thank you, Governor. We'll have you ask your question.
Hi, I'm Ainsley Sesniak. I'm a first year here at UNC, and I first wanted to
Did you say Ainsley?
Ainsley, yes.
Ainsley. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for your time tonight. This has just been phenomenal. As a nonprofit leader myself, some of the things that you've said about networking have really, really stuck with me. And so one of the things that I was curious about is you've mentioned a lot that process of creating a strategy and implementing a strategic plan. And I was just curious, what's sort of your process when you have the idea of that vision that you said of what you want to see happen? How do you go about assembling the voices that you need and making that concrete step-by-step strategy?
It's a great question, Ainsley. I'm not very linear, as you can probably tell from my answers in conversation today. I have a sense, maybe you're asking me in the context of government. Maybe I'll answer that way. I didn't think of the life sciences initiative that I referred to as the end game. I was thinking about how do we create opportunity when we have historic levels of unemployment. How do we grow our way out of recession? And how do we do it, in the short term, and how do we do it in a way that sustains itself right after I'm gone from the policy-making position? The great, for me, secret power of a governor is the convening power. You get anybody to come and sit at your conference table. And the fun thing for me was to get folks to come sit at the conference table who would not otherwise sit down with each other and problem solve together. And it was in those kinds of conversations when we're thinking about what are our sort of natural resources, right? This sort of kind of insane concentration of brain power because of all of the higher ed and the teaching hospitals and so on, so close together. It lends itself to certain industries, right? Life sciences or biotech is one, also clean tech, tech, for that matter, precision manufacturing, especially in the western part of the state. They played two strengths we had. Education, because I think it's the single best public dollar for long-term benefit you can spend. And so things like expanding early education, innovating around student, the achievement gap in particular. We got to, I'd made a pledge to fund the schools at the highest level ever, and we kept that pledge right through the recession, actually with the help of the rescue money from the federal administration. And the students repaid that investment, right? We were #1 in student achievement year after year after year, math and science in the whole country. And then infrastructure is sort of the unglamorous part of government, but it supports all the rest, right? It's what the government invests as a platform for personal ambition and private investment. So roads and rails and expansion of the internet, for example. Creates jobs right now, but also a platform going forward. That's how we thought about it. But I didn't come up with those components all on my own. It was a lot of conversation, a lot of listening, and asking open-ended questions of a lot of different people. Sure.
Thank you so much. And I would like to say a special thank you to Mary Margaret Frank, our Dean, and Governor Patrick for being here today. What a great series.